The bailiff's hand came up before I even reached the courtroom door. Not a gentle suggestion. A full stop, palm out, the kind that means you are not going in there. I had my folder pressed against my chest, my heels loud on the marble floor of the Williamson County Courthouse, and I had maybe 40 minutes before the hearing started without me. Ma'am. He was broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with the flat expression of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Are you Leah Carson?" I said yes. He reached into a folder tucked under his arm and handed me a document. "I need you to come with me." I didn't take the paper right away. I just looked at it, because something in my chest already understood that this was not a coincidence, and I needed one more second before I let that knowledge fully land. It was an emergency petition for involuntary psychiatric evaluation, filed at 8:14 that morning under my full name, my home address, my date of birth. The petitioner was listed as Daniel R. Carson. My brother. I read the allegations out loud, quietly, to myself, standing in that hallway. Erratic behavior, verbal threats made to family members, inability to care for self, paranoid ideation regarding family finances. I looked up at the bailiff. "He filed this today? This morning?" "Filed and processed." "I'm not in a position to evaluate the merits, ma'am. Under Tennessee procedure, I'm required to hold you until a mental health evaluator can assess." "How long does that take?" He exhaled through his nose. 2 to 3 hours, typically. The hearing was in 40 minutes. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I want to tell you I took a breath, thought it through, and responded with perfect clarity. The truth is that for about 4 seconds, I just stood there, holding that paper, and felt the specific kind of sick you feel when someone you grew up with decides to use the entire machinery of the legal system as a weapon against you. When your own brother looks at your grief and sees an opening. Then I asked to speak with the victim's liaison officer. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without the 3 years before it. My mother's name was Patricia Ann Carson. Everyone called her Pat. She was 71 when she was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's, and she was 73 when it became clear that living alone in the house she'd owned for 30 years was no longer safe. I was 35 at the time, working as a nurse practitioner at a hospital 40 minutes from her, and I made a decision that I don't regret, not for a single day, even with everything that came after. I transferred to a clinic 12 minutes from her house. I took the pay cut. I went over every morning before work to make sure she'd eaten and taken her medication. And I went over every evening to sit with her and help her with whatever the day had made difficult. Daniel lived in Atlanta. He called on her birthday and at Christmas, and sometimes not even then. It wasn't bitterness that drove me. I want to be clear about that. I didn't move closer to my mother because I was angling for anything. I did it because she was my mother, and because she was scared, and because I was the one who answered the phone at 2 a.m. when she'd fallen and couldn't get herself up. And I was the one who sat across from her doctor in February of the year she died and asked the questions that needed asking. Daniel was not there for any of that. He sent a edible arrangements basket once. What he was there for, it turned out, was the money. My mother updated her will 14 months before she died. She worked with our family's estate attorney, a woman named Margaret Yu, who had known our family for 20 years. The new will left the house on Birchwood Lane, her savings account of roughly $180,000, and the small custom jewelry business she'd run out of her home studio for decades, all of it to me. She also included a separate notarized letter, kept on file with Margaret's office, explaining her reasoning in her own words, why she was making the choices she made. Why Daniel, who had borrowed $90,000 from her 11 years ago and repaid exactly zero of it, was not a primary beneficiary. She was lucid when she wrote that letter. She was careful. She had thought about it for months before she put it on paper. I know this because she talked to me about it, sometimes late at night when neither of us could sleep, the two of us sitting in her kitchen with the light over the stove on because she always said overhead lights were too harsh after 9 o'clock. She told me she wanted me to know she understood what I had given up. She told me she didn't want me to have to fight for it. She died on a Tuesday in October, which was 11 days after my 38th birthday. She went quietly, in her own bed, which is what she wanted. Daniel arrived for the funeral in a rented Escalade with Sandra, his wife, who had spoken to my mother maybe 6 times in the last decade. At the reception, while people were still eating and sharing stories about my mother, Daniel cornered me in the kitchen and asked when we could talk about the estate. I told him to give it a week. He said the market was fluctuating and the house shouldn't sit. I walked away. The will contest was filed 3 weeks after the funeral. Daniel's attorney claimed my mother had lacked testamentary capacity due to cognitive decline at the time of the will's revision. He used the word dementia in the filing, My mother did not have dementia. She had Parkinson's. There is a difference. And the distinction mattered enormously, and Daniel knew it, which is why he chose the word deliberately. He also alleged undue influence, that I had manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman into cutting out her other child. That is the allegation that made me put the filing down on my kitchen table and sit very still for a long time, because of everything my mother and I had been through together, and because of what it means to call the most honest, clear-eyed woman I have ever known a victim of manipulation. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in February. Margaret Yu had advised me to appear personally, to bring documentation of my mother's medical history, showing her cognitive clarity in the months before she updated her will, and to be prepared to submit the notarized letter as Exhibit A. I had everything organized. I had taken the day off work. I had driven 45 minutes to the courthouse and found parking, and walked through the cold to the entrance, and gone through security and gone up one flight of stairs, and walked down the hallway toward the courtroom where the hearing was set to begin. And then the bailiff's hand came up. The victim's liaison officer was a woman named Diane, maybe 50, with reading glasses on a beaded chain. I was brought into a small side office, and I sat down across from her, and I put the petition on the desk between us. I need you to look at the specific incidents listed, I said. Every single one of them has a date and a time. She looked. There were 4 listed incidents. An alleged verbal altercation at my mother's home on November 9th, between 8 and 10 in the morning. An alleged threatening phone call on November 22nd, around noon. An alleged erratic appearance at my brother's hotel during a visit to Nashville on December 4th, late afternoon. And an alleged confrontation at my mother's attorney's office on December 19th. I opened my folder and took out 4 printed records. I'm a nurse practitioner at Sumner Medical Group. We use an RFID badge system for every entry and exit. These are my check-in logs. I laid them down one by one. November 9th. I had badged into work at 7:52 in the morning and not badged out until 5:41 in the afternoon. November 22nd. I had worked a half day, badged in at 7:45, badged out at 12:58. The alleged threatening call was listed as occurring at noon. I was in a patient exam room at noon. That was verifiable through the electronic health records system. December 4th. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, attending a continuing education conference. I had the registration confirmation, the hotel receipt, and the conference badge scan showing I had checked in for the afternoon session at 2:15. December 19th. I had never been to my brother's attorney's office. I had never been to that building. I didn't even know where it was until the filing listed the address. Diane looked at the documents. She looked at the petition. She looked at the documents again. She took her glasses off, put them back on. "Where is your brother right now?" she asked. "In that courtroom," I said. "Waiting for a hearing where, if I don't show up, the judge will likely proceed in a way that benefits him." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. "I want to tell you what happened in that hallway outside Diane's office while she made calls, because the waiting is a part of the story too." I stood with my back against the wall and I looked at the floor, and I thought about my mother's kitchen and the light over the stove. I thought about November mornings helping her button her coat because her hands shook too much. I thought about the way she laughed, this low, private laugh she had when something genuinely delighted her, and how she had directed that laugh at me more times in 4 years than I could count. I thought about Daniel at the funeral, asking about the market. The thing about grief is that it does not pause for legal proceedings. It just sits inside you while everything else happens around it, and you carry it like a second skeleton. And sometimes it makes you stronger than you thought you were, and sometimes it just makes you stand in courthouse hallways, pressing a folder to your chest and breathing through your nose because the alternative is falling apart completely. Diane came back out. "The petition has been flagged," she said. "I'm releasing you on my authority pending review of the documentation discrepancies. I'd strongly recommend you get into that courtroom." I walked down the hallway. I pushed open the door. I was 17 minutes late. The judge was a woman named Honorable Carol Pratt, and she looked up from her papers with the particular expression of a judge whose time has been wasted. Daniel was at one table with his attorney, a man in a gray suit. Margaret Yu was at the other table, with an empty chair beside her. I took the empty chair. "Miss Carson," Judge Pratt said, "you were expected at 9. I was detained in the hallway by a bailiff, Your Honor, pursuant to a psychiatric hold petition filed by my brother this morning." I set the petition on the table. I'd like to enter it into the record, along with documentation demonstrating that each incident listed in the petition is factually impossible based on verifiable employment and travel records. The judge looked at the petition. She looked at Daniel's attorney. She looked at Daniel. The silence in that room had weight to it. Daniel's attorney stood. Your Honor, we have no knowledge of. Sit down, Judge Pratt said, not loudly. She didn't need to be loud. She read the petition. She read it carefully, and I watched her face do the slow recalibration that faces do when something makes less and less sense the more you look at it. Then she looked at my employment logs. She looked at the Charlotte hotel receipt. She set everything down and folded her hands. Mr. Carson, she said to Daniel, your attorney will advise you not to answer my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, so the record reflects that I asked it. Did you file this petition this morning with the knowledge that it would prevent your sister from appearing at this hearing? Daniel's attorney did what attorneys do, but the judge had already moved on. We're proceeding, she said. And I'm referring the petition to the district attorney's office for review of potential filing of false information with the court. What happened over the next 2 hours was careful and methodical and not particularly dramatic, except that it was, because every piece of it was about my mother. Margaret Yu walked through the timeline of the will revision. She explained that our mother had come to her voluntarily, had asked specific and detailed questions about her options, and had returned on 3 separate occasions before signing. She submitted the medical records from my mother's neurologist, who had documented normal cognitive function and clear decision-making capacity at every appointment during the relevant period. Then she submitted the notarized letter. The judge read it aloud. That was not something I had anticipated. My mother's words, in my mother's voice, read into the official record of a probate court proceeding. She talked about the jewelry business and what she hoped I would do with it. She talked about what it had meant to her to have me close. She talked about Daniel and the loan, directly, without cruelty but without softening it either, because my mother was honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable, which is one of the things I loved most about her. And she talked about her reasons for the choices she made, in language that was precise and personal and absolutely, unmistakably, the language of a woman in full possession of her own mind. Daniel's attorney challenged the medical documentation. The challenge was thin. The judge was not impressed by thin. She ruled before noon. The will was upheld in its entirety. The contest was dismissed. My mother's estate was to be administered as written. The Birchwood Lane house, the savings, the jewelry business mine, as my mother had intended. And then the part I want to dwell on for a moment, because the comment section of every story like this always asks about consequences. And I think they're right to ask, because consequences are what separates a story from a lesson. The psychiatric hold petition Daniel filed that morning was referred to the district attorney. Filing a false psychiatric petition in Tennessee is a Class A misdemeanor, and when the DA's office reviewed the documentation I had provided, the badge logs, the travel records, the conference verification, they upgraded the inquiry to include potential fraud charges related to the will contest as well, because the same pattern of fabrication appeared in both filings. Daniel's attorney quietly withdrew from representation 2 weeks later. I got a call from Margaret in March. She told me Daniel had entered into a negotiated agreement, probation, community service, and mandatory repayment of the $90,000 to my mother's estate, which now belonged to me. I want to be honest with you about something. When I heard that last part, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I had won something. What I felt was tired and sad and a little hollowed out, the way you feel after a long illness finally breaks. My mother didn't leave me those things so I could fight for them in a courthouse. She left them to me because she wanted me taken care of, and because she trusted me to carry forward the things she had spent her life building. The jewelry business is still running. I hired 2 women who had trained under her. We work out of the same studio, under the same light, and sometimes when I'm there alone late in the afternoon, I still half expect to hear her laugh. But I am also not naive about what would have happened if I hadn't walked down that courthouse hallway with my folder, if I hadn't known to ask for the liaison officer, if I hadn't kept those badge logs printed and organized in a folder I'd been building for weeks, because some quiet part of me had understood from the moment Daniel asked about the market at our mother's funeral reception that this was coming and I needed to be ready. The systems we trust, the courts, the legal processes, the procedures that are supposed to protect people, they can be turned sideways by someone who understands how to use them. Daniel understood that a psychiatric hold petition filed on the morning of a hearing could tie me up for 2 to 3 hours with no one looking too hard at whether it was legitimate. He understood that I would be standing in a hallway while a judge looked at his paperwork and not mine. What he didn't understand was that the same documentation that's supposed to make systems work, the timestamps, the badge logs, the electronic records, the notarized letters kept on file for exactly these moments. Those things cut both ways. He weaponized the system, and the system's own paper trail dismantled him. There are people who will tell you that the lesson here is to trust your family. I am not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you to keep your records. Keep your badge logs and your travel receipts and your voicemails and your time-stamped emails. Keep the letter your mother wrote to her attorney explaining exactly what she wanted and why. Keep the documentation that proves where you were on November 9th and November 22nd and December 4th. Not because you are paranoid, because you are paying attention. And paying attention is sometimes the only thing that stands between you and a Tuesday morning in a courthouse hallway when someone else has already made their move. My mother told me once, in that kitchen, with the light over the stove casting everything in that specific kind of warm that made late nights bearable, that she wasn't worried about me. She said it the way she said most things she meant, which was quietly and without decoration. She said she knew I would be fine because I had always known how to stay steady when things got hard. I think about that on the difficult days. I think she was right.